Today I'm going to be talking about how to create sunlight in your painting. And it's a very simple idea of using color temperature contrast to create the idea of sunlight. The idea that sunlit areas are going to be warmer colors and shadows are going to be cooler colors. It's a very simple idea, but it can become very complicated the more refined our painting can get. So we're going to look at some paintings by some artists and how they suggest the light in their painting. Then we're going to look at some references and show the paintings of the references and talk about the contrast of warm and cool color. So we're starting here with Hanson Puthoff, early California Impressionist. And you can see the idea that all the shadows are cooler up here in the mountains, the tree, the shadows on the ground. They all have some form of blue in it that dominate the shadows. Then in the sunlit areas, they all have some form of yellow that dominate the light areas. And that contrast of warm and cool is what gives us the suggestion of sunlight. But then there's a lot of subtle changes within that also help the painting. One of them is the shadows in the foreground, like on this tree here, are not as cool as the shadows in the background. So shadows, being cool compared to the light areas, do get cooler yet as they recede, or they get a little warmer as they come forward. So this tree here that's in the shadow is cooler than the yellow-green grass, but this tree is a little bit warmer than the shadows in the background. And that not only creates the warm and cool contrast that gives us the light, but it gives us depth, because the shadows, being cool in the foreground, are not as cool as the shadows in the background. It can get kind of confusing. I think the basic idea is very simple, but it gets more complicated as you refine the painting. The idea that everything gets cooler as it recedes. So even the light areas back in here that are warm, they aren't quite as warm or intense color-wise as the light areas up front. So let's go to another Hanson Puthoff painting. Now this one throws a little bit of a wrench in things, in that the foreground now is in shadow and the background is getting the sunlight. So the foreground is a lot cooler than the background. So in this case, it's cooler up front, again, because of the cast shadow. So the rules that everything gets cooler as it goes back is correct, but it's just a basic rule to help us understand kind of the idea of depth and sunlight and shadow. But everything changes, and the minute you throw a big, mountain shadow over the foreground and sunlight in the background, that kind of changes. But understanding the basic idea really helps us to create the idea of sunlight and shadow using color temperature. So here, the sunlit mountain is warmer, of course, in the sunlight. The shadows are really cool, and that creates that suggestion of light. Now, the shadows in the foreground aren't quite as cool because they're in the foreground. They get a lot bluer as they recede. And there's no sunlight in the foreground. All the sunlight is in the background and on some of these trees here. But it's still really warm in the sunlight in the background. But if you could see sunlight up in here, it would be a lot warmer yet. So again, the idea is simple, but it can become really confusing. Here's a small little limited color pastel by Colin Campbell Cooper. He was a American Impressionist, painted mostly in New York, but I have a West Coast landscape by him here in a minute. But here he's got kind of limited colors, just a basic yellow, yellow-orange for the sunlit areas. All these light areas, very warm, kind of a warmer gray down here. And then the shadows are all cool, using some black, some blue violet. So that contrast of warmer and cool colors suggests the light. Even though there's not much drawing, not everything is rendered as high as it can go, but that contrast of warm and then the cool really suggests what is after the sunlight. And if you can make the sunlight capturing the light, basically, because even on a cloudy day, you still have light. And you want to capture what the light is doing, whether it's cloudy day or sunlit day. And if you can make that your goal in your painting, when you're painting, still life, landscape, portrait, capture what the light is doing to the form. That simplifies things a lot more than trying to make everything perfect. So if I'm painting a landscape, my main goal is to capture what the light's doing. Drawing may not be as great, or may not be able to render something quite as well, but if I've captured the light, I consider it a successful painting. Now this is Helen McNichol. She was a Canadian impressionist, turn of the century. And here you can see again, the foreground is in shadow, everything's cooler, and the sunlight in the background. She's using primary yellow in the background on practically everything, just to make it look sunlit. She's really pushing that warmer against the cooler. And overwhelmingly, there's more blue here, and overwhelmingly, there's more yellow there. And that contrast of the warm and cool is what suggests the sunlight in the picture. Now, there is a lot of warm colors in the shadow. This orange, yellow, yellow-orange, some yellow over here. But they're a cooler version of orange. In other words, there's a touch of blue in here, maybe a touch of violet in the yellow, as opposed to the yellow in the background. And that's the key. It's a comparison. Something is cool or warm compared to what's next to it. So I can't isolate a color and just make it a temperature and say that's going to suggest shadow or sunlight. It's cool compared to the sunlight, or it's warmer compared to the shadow. So it's always a comparison. You can't isolate color and just make it a temperature to suggest light. It has to be a comparison. So this yellow here is really warm, but it's cool compared to the sunlight in the background building. Here's a painting by Jack Wilkinson Smith. Yeah, again, I've got a lot of foreground shadow, background sunlight. But everything in the shadow is more blue. Blue violet for the rocks, blue green, blue violet in the shadows here. There's still some browns or red orange in the leaves and orange, but they're slightly cooler compared to the yellow orange of the sunlit leaves. And then the shadow in the background, really strong, intense blue, and that stays back there in the background. And that works real well as shadow and depth as well. Now, if there was sunlight here on the rocks in front or on the sand in front, it would be a lot warmer. So if there was some dappled light coming through here, I think Jack would mind if I add a little, that would be warmer compared to the shadow. So that contrast of warm and cool is what's going to make that work as dappled sunlight. Here's one by Frank Brangwyn. He was a British painter, again, turn of the century. I don't know what context these are in, whether they're just studies for bigger paintings. There's a lot of these of Venice he did. And there's not much color to them. It's basically blue and orange with maybe one or two other colors. He's got some green up here. But everything in the sunlight is a lot warmer, more on the orange side or yellow-green, some kind of yellow-based color. And then the shadows, maybe more black than blue, but cooler. Black is a cool color, if you can call black a color. And then, of course, he has some blue, the blue shirt, just local color. But even here, the orange on the side of the wall is more of a cool orange compared to the warmer orange here. Now, everything is slightly muted. The orange isn't as strong as it can be straight from the tube. Slightly muted, either with black or blue, but still muted, but still looks really warm compared to the shadow. And that's the idea. And of course, along with the idea of warm and cool color contrast, you have to have the idea of light and dark contrast as well. So the shadows being cooler have to be darker. enough value contrast compared to the lights to create that idea of sunlight. So another Colin Campbell Cooper, looks like Yosemite in the winter, so everything's kind of covered with snow. So everything in the sunlight is going to be a very light yellow, yellow-orange, red-orange, and then the shadows in here. Very, very cool. Now there's some orange in the shadows, but they're cooled with a little bit of blue, blue-violet. The shadows here on the snow, more blue, a little bit of warmer in the sunlight streaming through. So it's pushing that contrast, warm whites and cool whites that make the suggestion of the sunlight on the snow. So another Hansen put off, again, foreground and shadow, but very cool here. A lot of blue, blue-green, green, a bit on the cool side, more blue in that green than yellow. And then the sunlight here, a bit more yellow. A lot of yellow back in here. You say, well, it's an autumn tree. It's a yellow-orange colored, local color leaf. But still, the sun is hitting it and it's warmer compared to the shadows, which are a bit more violet in here. And that contrast creates that idea of sunlight in shadow. It almost creates kind of a vibration when you get the yellow orange next to a muted blue. Really pushes the idea of sunlight and shadow. And a lot of times, especially working for photography, you have to push it. You can't just copy the photograph and expect to have that temperature contrast. You have to push the idea of using warmer colors more than what you see in the reference, because the photograph doesn't do a great job always of showing that. Now let's look at some photographs. This is a photograph I took in Georgia, Cleveland, Georgia, I think, somewhere around in there, northern Georgia. And this was a stream here that I couldn't see from where I'm standing, but I did some sketching and photographing kind of all around, not just in one spot, and I could see the stream more. But I've got shadow in the foreground, and in here, in the dark and the light in the barns, and dark and the light in the trees. So I really want to push that temperature contrast between those, as well as the value contrast. You can't leave out the value, because that's what makes the temperature color work, is getting it the right value. So here's my cooler shadow colors in the grass, more blue-green than green or yellow-green, and even adding some straight blue in here, ultramarine, just to push that idea of temperature. And then a lot of yellow-green and yellow-green with orange in the sunlight. The orange just adds more variety to the color. A little bit of bluish green in here, just as kind of the color of the grass, different colors of grasses. Now, it is cooler than the yellow-green, but the yellow-green is going to dominate in this sunlit, grassy area. Same thing with the barn. More blue, blue-violet, very muted with burnt sienna or orange. That makes it a little grayer. And then same thing here, kind of a warm gray. This is blue with orange, and enough orange that this looks warmer than that. I mean, I'm trying to get them close together somewhat, but yet this really distinctively looks warmer and more sunlit, and this looks cooler and more in shadow. So I'm pushing both in opposite directions, warmer, cooler, but yet you can still see the blue, the gray in the sunlight. But it's still warmer than the shadow, and that's the key. The roof is violet, which is a cool color, but I've added enough yellow and orange to it to make it a warm violet. I can have a bluish object and still make it look sunlit by adding enough orange to it to make it warmer, again, compared to the sunlight or the shadow. Same thing back in here. As I go back in the distance, my shadows just get bluer. There's not much local color. And by local color, I mean we have yellow-green leaves, yellow-orange leaves. So there should be some yellow-orange in the shadow, and you can see that up front. Yellow, orange, and green in the shadow. But by the time I get back in here, those colors kind of disappear because of the depth, the atmosphere, kind of you lose that coloring, and all you're left with is blue shadows. And the yellow-green in the sunlight's a bit more muted than the yellow-green up in here. And that's going to show the distance. But the key is always to remember pushing that cooler, warmer contrast. Now this is in somewhere up north Georgia. I get real nice sunlight, shadow. That's what I'm usually out early in the morning, late in the afternoon, where there's more strong shadows because the sun is lower. Midday, like from about 10:30, 11 o'clock to about 2 or 3, the sun's pretty flat, especially in the summer. In the winter, sun's always slightly slanted, so you get some shadows most time. But early morning, late afternoon, you get more contrast of that dark and light and warm and cool because of the long shadow. A lot of strong sunlight in here and on the barns. Now compositionally, I want to zoom in because I'm really not that interested in all this stuff on the sides and in the front. I want to zoom in and make what's more important bigger than trying to just squeeze everything in. So zoomed in, really emphasize the strong sunlit colors in the trees. Almost too much. This yellow green, very intense. I didn't mute it much at all, or the sunlight on the ground, and really pushed the shadows a lot bluer. So I really increased the temperature contrast, making the trees a lot more yellow-orange in the green and yellow-green down here, and the shadows a lot more blue-green than just green. So pushing that temperature as much as possible. And sometimes it helps to overdo it. Do some paintings or color sketches or studies where you see how close to just blue you can get and how close to just yellow in the sunlight. Then you can back it off. You can scrub a color into the sunlight to move it a bit closer to the shadow and move the shadow a bit closer to the sunlight, but still keep the contrast. But in some paintings, I want to push it a bit more, like I did down here in the shadows on the grass. I really move that really towards the blue. So there's more contrast here. A little less up front, because up front it's closer and I can see a bit more warmth in the shadow than I can back in here. So a bit more yellow and orange in the green here, and mostly blue in the green back there in the shadow. Now this is in, where's this? Leapers Fork, Tennessee, painting with a group. And again, somewhat early in the morning, trying to show the sunlight. I really want to emphasize these simplified shapes and then push the temperature contrast. The more you can simplify your subject, the easier it is to get the right values and the right temperature. So you can see, really pushing this a lot bluer, and even this also a lot bluer than what I see. This was painted outside. I mean, this is more green, this is more blue, but they're both very cool compared to the sunlight. Again, it's always about comparison. The barn here in shadow, a bit more of a violet to blue violet, even some red violet in there. And then the sunlit areas, yellow, yellow-orange, yellow-green, green, all on the warm side, while keeping the shadows more blue, blue-violet, blue-green. And after I get them filled in and set up, I can go in and scrub in more color, as long as I don't lose that contrast. Here's a barn in Houston, Georgia. Again, late in the evening. I want to zoom in there and focus on the contrast. Now, there's not a lot of pure color. In other words, the barn is kind of a reddish orange, a muted red orange in the sunlight, and a muted blue violet in the shadow. So here I've pushed the orange, a little bit of violet in the orange to kind of mute it, some yellow orange in there as well, and a lot of blue violet, a little bit of blue green there, and a lot of cooler blue green in the shadow, some spots of blue, just as accent colors to push those shadows more into the cooler range to contrast the yellow, yellow-green, yellow-orange in the sunlight. Same thing in the sheep, just warm and cool. Now, with that temperature contrast, again, comes the value contrast. If I don't have my values right, the temperature won't work as well. But understanding that warm and cool concept really helps suggest. Here's another one, northern Georgia. And you're just pushing the temperature a lot bluer in the background to make the shadows recede more. And here the shadows get a little bit of reflected light. The sun is hitting here and then bouncing into the shadow. So it's a little bit of a warmer shadow here, but not as warm as the sunlight. So be careful when you paint reflected light. It looks warm, and it is, but not warm compared to the sunlight. Really pushing the shadows here with a lot of blue, blue-violet, blue-green, and real strong yellow here. Here's a barn, also in Houston, Georgia. Late in the evening, and has a few areas of sunlight, real strong. And you notice in the photographs, there's just no temperature here. It's just kind of black and a little brown. Same thing with the shadows in here. Shadows here look cool, bluish green, but I can push that a bit more. So don't go with the photograph with the idea of trying to copy what's there. You won't suggest the temperature. So the shadows, a lot more blue in the darker green, a lot more blue in the foreground. Sometimes you can add that blue afterwards. I prefer when I block in my shadows to go a bit bluer. Then I can always pull it back if I need to. Make it slightly warmer if it goes too blue, but pushing it as much as possible to me is beneficial because I get that sense of sunlight and shadow right away. And again, pushing the light areas really warm. This was a little pastel study I did on spot of the same area with the idea of pushing the contrast. Shadows here are just straight blue. And then the sunlit areas are warm green and orange. Same thing down here, a lot of blue and the shadows in the foreground. So again, I'm thinking, color-wise, I'm thinking strictly temperature. I'm not worried all that much about the local color of things. Last one here, another northern Arizona. Early morning, long shadows, strong sunlight, and pushing the temperature. It's a small little study. Really yellow, green, and light areas. A lot of cool colors in the greens, from blue, violet, blue-green, some kind of cooler red, orange, but everything separated by temperature to create that sense of strong sunlight. Now, on a cloudy day, it's different. The contrast isn't there as much. In fact, the light areas can be a bit cooler and the shadows slightly warmer, but not much contrast. On a cloudy day, the colors are more richer, a little stronger, more value contrast between the planes of a landscape. Well, I hope that was helpful. Helped to understand a little bit more about how to create sunlight in your landscape. And we will see you next time.